When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because of the messages I had forgotten to delete. I reached for the phone, trying to grab it back from his hands, but he moved it away with surprising ease and kept reading. I watched his face change as his eyes moved line by line, and I could feel my life unraveling in real time. Yes, he was going to find out the truth. But not all of it. His fingers trembled as he kept scrolling, and I knew he was getting closer to the message, the one that could destroy everything. Or worse, the one that would confuse him beyond repair. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his hands. A new notification appeared on the screen. I saw the blood drain from his face as he read the name of the sender. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I've had since childhood, whenever I get nervous. My nerves were tangled with the horror of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from across the room. This was the moment I had feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed everything. And now, I don't know how to fix any of it. But let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I've tried so hard to keep hidden, comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. And answer me this: have you ever had a secret you tried to bury so deep, but in the end, it came back to the surface anyway? It was a Thursday morning, the kind that usually passed without leaving a trace. I was rinsing the coffee pot while the sun barely lit the edge of our small kitchen window. My husband sat at the table, already dressed for work, staring into his phone with that furrowed brow that made his age more visible. He didn't say good morning. He hadn't said that in a while. I set the mug down in front of him, he didn't notice. No thank you, no glance. Just the quiet tapping of his thumb against glass. That's how our days started now. It wasn't always like this. I remember when mornings meant a kiss on the cheek, a hand on the lower back, shared glances that spoke louder than words. Those things vanished quietly, like the slow dimming of a light you don't notice until you're sitting in the dark. I didn't resent him, not really. I knew he was stressed, and that his job demanded more from him than it should. But part of me had started to wonder when I stopped being part of his equation. That afternoon, I walked into the conference room, arms full of printed reports and leftover tension. My job wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it, organized, steady, predictable. The opposite of how I felt inside. I barely noticed the new figure near the window until he spoke. You must be the one keeping this place from burning down. His voice was calm, low, with just enough humor to make me pause. I turned, and there he stood. A man I didn't recognize, in a tailored navy suit, holding a tablet in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, too self-assured. I'm overseeing the operations review for this quarter, he added. Your department's already ahead of the others. That's rare. I said thank you. I didn't smile. But something in my chest shifted. Later, I found out who he was. The new regional director. My husband's new boss. That evening, I mentioned it in passing as we sat in front of the television. The new director stopped by today, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Seems like he's going to be involved closely this quarter. My husband nodded, didn't look away from the screen. Yeah, he's been shaking things up. Micromanaging. Let me know if he gets in your way. I wanted to say something, anything. Maybe that he wasn't just another suit. That he'd looked at me, not past me. But instead I just nodded and pulled the blanket over my legs. Over the next week, he appeared more frequently. He asked questions, gave feedback, complimented my spreadsheets, not in the shallow way people do, but with precision. Like he actually saw the work behind the surface. One morning, I caught myself choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in months. It fit a little snugger now, but I wore it anyway. I told myself it was for confidence. That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Then came the first meeting where it was just the two of us. He asked if I could review some adjustments to the project timeline. We sat across from each other in the smaller meeting room, the one with the old blinds and the smell of stale paper. He leaned back as I spoke, eyes on me, not on the charts. I felt exposed in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. When I asked if anything needed clarification, he said, "No. I just like hearing someone speak with certainty. It's rare these days." The silence that followed should have felt awkward, but it didn't. It felt like a held breath. Later that day, I watched my husband pore over blueprints at the kitchen table. He didn't notice I'd been standing there for 3 minutes. I brought him water. He mumbled thanks. That was it. In bed, I lay awake next to him, listening to the low hum of his snoring. I studied the ceiling like it might offer answers. My body was warm under the covers, but I felt cold inside. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And yet, something was shifting. Slowly, quietly, dangerously. That weekend, as I folded laundry, my phone buzzed. A message from a number I hadn't saved yet. "Thank you for today. You carried that meeting. Impressive doesn't begin to cover it." I stared at it for a full minute before locking the screen and tucking the phone face down. My pulse was loud in my ears. That night, as I sat next to my husband on the couch, pretending to listen to the TV, I realized I'd memorized that message. Word for word. The following Monday, the director passed by my desk. No words. Just a glance. And in that glance, I felt like someone again. Not invisible. Not ignored. Seen. The following days unfolded like a slow, silent wave I couldn't stop. Everything looked the same on the surface, my desk with its framed photo, the familiar hum of the office printer, my husband's footsteps in the kitchen, but beneath it all, something had shifted. Or maybe I had. I began to notice the little things more sharply. How the new director never raised his voice. How he took notes while others spoke. How he seemed to remember what each person had said, even in casual conversations. I wasn't used to that. Most people, including my husband, let your words fall into silence like stones in water. With him, they stayed afloat. Our interactions were professional. Technically. There were no lingering touches, no private jokes. But something unspoken had begun threading between us, and I felt it tightening, slowly. It lived in the pauses, in the half-smiles, in the glance that held 1 second too long. That morning, I wore a soft, dusty blue blouse I hadn't touched in years. It fit better than I remembered. As I adjusted the collar, I caught my own reflection and paused. I looked aware. Not beautiful, not transformed, but aware. It was the first time in a while I saw myself without fog in my eyes. That afternoon, he asked me to join a small group reviewing a new proposal. The others filtered out after the meeting, distracted by lunch plans and inboxes. I stood to leave as well, but he gestured for me to stay a moment. He closed the file on his desk and folded his hands. "You've got good instincts," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've seen a lot of people who know their job. You actually understand the rhythm of things. That's different." I nodded, unsure how to respond. It was a compliment, but it carried weight beyond the words. He paused. "I hope this doesn't make things complicated for you." There it was. The acknowledgement. Not of an action, but of a presence. Attention. A shift. I didn't know how to answer, so I gave the safest possible response. "I'm just doing my work." He smiled faintly. "That's the difference." Some people show up. You see through. It would have been harmless, all of it. Just words. But my heart beat louder as I walked back to my desk. I felt heat rising on my chest, just below my collarbone. My hands shook slightly when I reached for my keyboard. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that from a conversation. At home, everything was in its place. My husband was in the garage, reorganizing his tools. I asked if he needed anything. He didn't look up. Said he was fine. I stood there a moment longer than needed, then quietly walked back into the house. The next morning, I arrived early to the office. The hallway was still quiet, computers asleep. I liked it this way, less noise, less need for small talk. As I passed the director's door, I noticed the light was already on. His silhouette moved behind the frosted glass, tall and deliberate. I kept walking. I didn't trust myself to stop. At noon, I found a note on my desk. Not a message, not a text, an actual note, written in ink on stiff paper. My name at the top. Inside, meeting rescheduled. If you're free, I'd appreciate your feedback on the presentation draft. Below, a room number I hadn't seen before. Room 3C. One of the old conference rooms on the quieter floor. Used less often, probably for that very reason. I told myself it was routine. Just work. But I still smoothed my hair before stepping inside. The room was small, plain, the blinds half closed. He was at the far end, leaning against the table, arms crossed casually. "Thanks for making time," he said. We reviewed the slides, discussed the structure, adjusted a few phrases. It was all normal. Productive. But when I reached across the table to point at a bullet point, our hands brushed. I pulled back quickly, murmuring sorry, but he didn't move. His gaze didn't drop. And then we kissed. Just once. No words. No hesitation. No apology. Just the soft press of mouths in a space where silence had been carrying too much. When I stepped back, I could hear my own heartbeat. It was louder than the city outside, louder than the buzz of the old ceiling light, louder than my own thoughts. He didn't speak. I didn't either. I left the room without turning back. On the elevator ride down, I stared at the changing numbers like they were counting something more than just floors. When I reached my desk, I sat down, opened a spreadsheet, and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes without doing a thing. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel wanted. I felt undone. That night, my husband asked what we should have for dinner. I told him I didn't care. He shrugged and ordered Thai. We ate in silence, the sound of forks against plastic containers the only real conversation. He didn't notice anything different. Or maybe he did. And chose to say nothing. Lying in bed, I replayed the kiss in my mind. Not the act, but the why. Why it happened. Why I let it happen. Why it felt like a beginning and an end at once. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about desire. It was about being acknowledged. Being seen. Being something more than the background noise in someone else's life. I turned to face the ceiling, blanket up to my chin, body still, thoughts not. The silence between me and my husband had grown so familiar that even now, it didn't feel wrong. Just inevitable. But something had changed. I had changed. And there would be no turning back. The following morning was quiet. Almost too quiet. I moved through the motions like someone tracing the outline of their own life. Coffee. Dishes. The sound of water running. The ticking of the wall clock. I could hear every detail, every sound louder than usual, like my senses had been rewired overnight. Even the fabric of my blouse felt more present on my skin. My husband sat in his usual spot, skimming through news on his tablet, one hand around a half-empty mug. He asked nothing. I offered nothing. It struck me that this silence, which once offered comfort, now felt like a space I didn't belong to. I caught myself glancing at his profile and wondering how long it had been since he had really looked at me. Not glanced, not nodded absently, but looked. Studied. Seen. At work, everything seemed normal, and that alone made me uncomfortable. The day passed in routine. Meetings. Emails. Spreadsheets. The casual greetings of coworkers in the hallway. No messages from him. No accidental run-ins. No glances. No notes. It should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it unsettled me. I had expected something. Maybe regret. Maybe tension. Anything. But there was nothing. And that nothing dug under my skin like a splinter. By lunchtime, I realized I'd been checking my phone compulsively, just out of sight, under the table, screen lighting up only for calendar reminders and promotional spam. I locked it again and slid it into my drawer. He wasn't going to reach out. And that should have meant something. That evening, my husband surprised me by suggesting we eat out. Not something extravagant, just a local place we used to visit more often when time felt softer between us. I agreed without hesitation. Maybe part of me wanted to balance the scale, or maybe I just needed to remember what us used to look like. The restaurant hadn't changed. The same vinyl booths, the same dusty artwork on the walls, the same laminated menus with corners frayed by time. We sat across from each other, pretending to study the options. He eventually ordered his usual. I picked something different, something I hadn't tried before. A small rebellion, meaningless and quiet. Our conversation drifted around work and errands, people we both knew but no longer saw often. At some point, he mentioned the new director. He's been more hands-on than I expected, my husband said, stirring his iced tea without looking up. They say he came from a different region. Cleaned house over there. Hope he's not planning the same here. I nodded, taking a slow sip of water. My fingers tightened slightly around the glass. He looked up then, just briefly, and added, "You've had some contact with him, haven't you? Heard he's working closely with operations." I shrugged. Some. He's very involved. Too involved, maybe. The words floated there a second too long. I couldn't tell if it was a test or just a passing comment. Either way, I smiled softly, then looked down at my plate. After dinner, we walked to the car in silence. The wind was cooler than I expected, and I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself. He didn't offer his arm. I didn't ask. Inside the car, he adjusted the air vents, turned the engine, and said nothing. Back home, I washed my face longer than usual, letting the water run hot over my skin. It wasn't guilt I was rinsing away. It was tension. Or maybe a longing I couldn't name. In the mirror, my face looked the same. But I knew better. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again, the familiar cracks in the paint like a map I had memorized too well. My husband was already asleep, his breathing slow and even. I turned toward him, just to see if I felt anything different. Love? Resentment? Pity? Mostly, I felt distance. Not anger. Just the slow, steady erosion that happens when people stop seeing each other, stop reaching, stop noticing. The next morning, I hesitated before stepping into the office. My heart picked up pace as I passed his door. It was open. He was inside, speaking with two managers. He didn't glance at me. I didn't linger. I walked straight past, pretending not to care. Midday, an email arrived. Just a forwarded message with a short line at the top, "Appreciate your insights on this." No signature. No smiley face. Just neutral. Professional. Clean. I replied in kind. Efficient. Cordial. Distant. But later, I found myself reading that one-line message again, as though it had hidden meanings tucked between the words. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I was just looking for something that wasn't there. That afternoon, during a team huddle, he addressed me only once, asking about a data set. I answered clearly. Confidently. He nodded. No more, no less. I left the meeting with a strange sensation building in my chest. Was that how it would be now? A moment shared, then locked away in silence? By evening, I was pacing the kitchen. I opened the fridge 3 times without taking anything. Checked my phone. Nothing. Deleted a notification about a sale. Then sat down, elbows on the table, hands clasped. My husband walked in, loosened his tie, looked at me and said, "Everything okay?" I nodded too quickly. Just tired. He kissed my forehead, a gesture I barely noticed before, but now felt foreign. Not wrong, just disconnected. Like watching a movie scene where the actors don't quite believe their lines. I wondered then if he noticed the same distance. Or if he had grown used to it, just like I had. That night, I didn't sleep. Not truly. I closed my eyes, but my mind moved through rooms, through meetings, through moments I couldn't rewind or explain. I thought of his silence. Of mine. Of the line we'd crossed and the one we were now pretending never existed. And I asked myself, over and over, a question I couldn't answer. If it meant nothing, why couldn't I let it go? The air in the office had a different weight that week. It wasn't just me, others sensed it too, though they wouldn't have known how to name it. There was a heaviness in the way people moved, in the longer silences during meetings, in the way eyes avoided certain gazes. The quarterly evaluations were approaching, and everyone was trying to stay ahead of scrutiny. That was the official reason. But for me, it was something else entirely. I spent most of my days glued to my screen, working more efficiently than ever. Every task became a refuge. Every completed report, every double-checked email, every update to the shared calendar, it all kept my mind from wandering too far into places it wasn't ready to go. I thought if I moved fast enough, stayed focused enough, I could outrun the memory of that kiss. He didn't speak to me directly again that week. Not a word outside of formalities. Not a glance that lingered. Not even a nod in the hallway. It was as if we had both signed an unspoken agreement to erase the moment, to tuck it into a folder neither of us would open again. But erasing something doesn't mean it disappears. It just changes form. Thursday afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. She spoke about a client meeting scheduled out of town for next week and mentioned that they needed someone to accompany the regional director as logistical support. She said it matter-of-factly, without emphasis or hidden meaning. I nodded, took the itinerary she handed me, and walked back to my desk. The silence in my chest lasted until I reached my chair. Only then did I feel the pounding in my ears. He hadn't requested me. That's what I told myself. He probably hadn't even suggested my name. It was just a coincidence. A rotation. A routine decision. But still, I stared at that printout for several minutes, rereading the dates, the location, the travel details, like it might shift if I stared hard enough. That night, I told my husband about the upcoming trip over dinner. I framed it casually, just another part of the job. He nodded and asked when I'd be leaving. I told him Wednesday morning, back Friday evening. He didn't ask who I was traveling with. I didn't offer the name. Afterward, I stood at the sink, rinsing our dishes. The water was hot against my hands. My husband came up behind me, placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, and said, "You've been busy lately." I smiled without turning around. It's that time of year. He stayed there a moment, then returned to the living room. I stood with my hands in the water long after the plates were clean. The days leading up to the trip passed without incident. No direct messages. No hallway encounters. If anyone in the office knew, they didn't show it. Everything remained in its proper place: meetings, reports, email chains filled with polite formality. Tuesday night, I packed. Not much, just 2 outfits for the meetings, something casual for the evening, toiletries. I hesitated at the edge of the bed, holding my travel bag, unsure if I had forgotten something or remembered too much. My husband walked past the door, kissed me lightly on the head, and said, "Let me know when you land." I nodded. My mouth said thank you. My mind said nothing. The morning of the trip, I arrived at the airport early. He was already there, seated near the gate, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I approached and gave a short nod. No smile. Just acknowledgement. I mirrored his expression, sat 2 seats away, and pulled out my boarding pass. We didn't speak until we boarded. Our seats were in the same row, but not side by side. A middle seat between us. It was the perfect metaphor for what had become of the distance between us, present, defined, but unspoken. The flight was uneventful. During descent, I looked out the window, watching the city come into view. I had never been there before. A new place. Clean slate. That's what I told myself. At the hotel, we checked in separately. 2 rooms. Different floors. My keycard was heavier in my hand than it should have been. I carried my bag down the hall, opened the door, and stepped into a room that smelled like linen and air conditioning. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Our first meeting was scheduled for late afternoon. Plenty of time to review materials, change, and prepare. I sat at the desk, opened my laptop, and tried to focus. It worked for a while. Work has always been that way for me, a shield. Something to hold in front of the emotions I don't want to examine too closely. The meeting itself went well. He led with precision, I supported with notes and figures, the client responded positively. We were effective, synchronized, professional. As if nothing else had ever passed between us. After the meeting, he turned to me and said, "There's a follow-up tomorrow morning. We'll meet in the lobby at 7. I nodded. That was all. He walked away. I returned to my room. I ordered room service. Ate in silence, sitting by the window, looking at a city I didn't know. Somewhere outside, car horns and music floated through the glass. I felt invisible. Not in a painful way, but in a quiet, suspended way, like I was watching myself from far away. At some point, I opened my laptop again and responded to a few emails. My husband had sent me one line earlier, "Hope the flight went well." I replied, "Yes. Long day. We'll call tomorrow." I didn't call. That night, I lay in the hotel bed, the white sheets pulled tight around me. The hum of the AC was steady. My mind wasn't. I thought about the middle seat between us. About the silence. About how easily we both had stepped back into our roles. How maybe nothing had changed. Or maybe everything had, and we just didn't know how to admit it. At some point in the night, I fell asleep with the lights on. I dreamed of voices I couldn't hear and faces I couldn't see. I woke with the taste of absence in my mouth. Morning would come soon. Another meeting. Another mask. Another version of who I had become. But not yet. Not just yet. The morning came with a sharp kind of clarity. I opened my eyes to the pale gray light filtering through the curtains and sat up before the alarm had a chance to sound. The silence in the hotel room felt deeper than at home, less familiar, less forgiving. I moved quietly through the small space, making coffee with the single-serve machine on the desk, sipping it in slow, thoughtful gulps as I stared at my open suitcase on the chair. There was something strange about getting dressed in a place that wasn't yours. It made you look at your clothes differently. Every blouse and pair of slacks felt more deliberate, more like a statement than it ever did at home. I chose a dark green blouse with a soft neckline and simple black pants. Conservative, clean, appropriate. And yet, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed a softness around the eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. Downstairs, the lobby was still quiet. A few early risers lingered around coffee stations, their voices hushed and weary. I spotted him immediately, standing near the entrance, phone in hand, reading something intently. He wore a dark coat over a charcoal suit, and he looked tired but composed. Always composed. When he noticed me, he gave a small nod, then tucked his phone into his pocket. No words. Just a motion toward the exit. I followed. The client meeting was short and uneventful. We spoke with confidence, presented the plan, and left with polite handshakes and mild affirmations. He drove this time. A rental car, something compact and practical. I sat in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in my lap. He didn't speak, and I didn't either. The silence didn't feel heavy, just precise. Like we were both measuring something unspoken between us. Back at the hotel, he parked and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. He finally glanced over and said, "There's nothing else scheduled until late afternoon." I nodded, reaching for the door handle. But before I could step out, he said quietly, "Walk with me?" I paused. Just a second. Then I nodded again. We didn't go far. Just a few blocks away, toward a quiet park tucked behind an office complex. There was a narrow path lined with benches, a few trees that hadn't yet shed all their leaves. We walked slowly, matching pace without trying. It was the first time we were alone without a conference table or a shared screen between us. And yet, the distance still lingered. It was cautious. Respectful. Neither of us spoke until the path curved slightly, leading to a bench facing a small pond. He stopped walking and looked at the water. Then said, "That wasn't supposed to happen." I knew what he meant. But I waited. "It crossed a line," he added. I stayed quiet, letting the words hang in the air. He turned toward me then, his voice low and steady. "You have your life. I have mine. I'm not here to interfere with that." Still, I said nothing. Because what could I say? That I agreed? That I didn't? That the kiss still lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, haunting the space between thoughts? "I don't want this to become something that costs either of us more than we can afford," he continued. That struck a chord. Not because it was cold, but because it was true. Every look, every unspoken word, every shift in energy, it all added up. To what, I didn't know. But it had a weight. Finally, I said, "Neither do I." He nodded. And that was it. We walked back in silence. By the time we returned, it was nearing noon. We went our separate ways, each retreating to our rooms. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the carpet, replaying the conversation. It was direct. Respectful. Final, in a way. And yet, I didn't feel closure. I felt suspended, like someone had hit pause, not stop. Later that afternoon, we attended the last meeting on the schedule. It was straightforward. No surprises. We worked well together. Professional. Clear. Aligned. I wondered if anyone in the room could sense the tension beneath the surface, but no one looked at us twice. That evening, back at the hotel, I ordered a simple dinner and sat by the window again. I called my husband this time, gave him the usual report: meeting went well, hotel's clean, schedule looks good. He asked if I was tired. I said a little. He told me to rest. We hung up. I placed the phone on the table, screen down. It didn't buzz again. Around 9, I heard a knock at the door. It was light, tentative. I knew before I opened it. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes searching mine for a flicker of reaction. I didn't step back. I didn't speak. I simply held his gaze. We kissed. That's all that happened. 1 second, and then another, before the door closed behind us. The night continued. The hotel walls remained quiet. The city outside went about its rhythm, unaware of anything different behind those doors. In the morning, we didn't speak about it. There were no lingering glances. No final words. We returned home that afternoon. Separate cabs. Separate lives. I stepped into my house and dropped my bag gently near the stairs. My husband greeted me with a hug. I leaned into it. Dinner was already planned. He told me about his week, mostly small frustrations at work, a leaky faucet, a neighbor's barking dog. I listened. I nodded. I added a few thoughts of my own. That night, as I lay in bed, my body still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, I realized that some decisions don't announce themselves with thunder. They arrive quietly. A glance. A kiss. A night. And then they live inside you, silently altering everything that comes after. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But I knew it wouldn't stay quiet forever. The days that followed felt strangely normal, and maybe that was the part that unsettled me the most. The house smelled the same. The laundry basket filled itself in the same rhythm. My husband continued to move through the routines of his life with the same steady pace: coffee at 7, emails on the couch by 9, weekend errands with a list folded neatly in his back pocket. But something inside me had changed, and it wasn't dramatic or even visible. It was subtle, like when you wake up knowing you had a dream that you can't quite remember, but it stays with you anyway. A weight behind the ribs. A silence that felt thicker than usual. He didn't ask much about the trip, and I didn't offer. We shared small stories over dinner, light, harmless details. I mentioned that the hotel was comfortable, that the meetings were efficient. I said nothing about the park, the walk, the words we exchanged. I definitely didn't say anything about the kiss. The second one. The one I hadn't expected but hadn't stopped either. At work, everything picked up pace. Reports were due, the budget season was approaching, and meetings ran longer than usual. He stayed professional, more than ever before. No notes. No looks. No slips. We spoke only when necessary and only about work. Anyone watching would have seen two colleagues functioning smoothly. No tension. No trace of anything else. That made it worse. I found myself reading too much into the smallest moments. The way he walked past my desk without even glancing. The way he kept his voice neutral in meetings. I told myself this was what I had wanted, a return to boundaries, to silence. But it didn't feel clean. It felt like pretending. One morning, as I left for the office, my husband called out from the kitchen, asking if I'd seen his watch. I said I hadn't. His voice was calm, but something about the way he looked at me then made my chest tighten. Not suspicion, more like distance. That kind of polite detachment you show when you've stopped expecting closeness. At work, I buried myself in spreadsheets and agendas, using tasks as a shield. I worked through lunch, avoided idle conversations, and declined 2 coffee invitations from colleagues who noticed I wasn't as chatty as usual. I smiled and said I had too much to finish. That wasn't a lie. One evening, I stayed late. The office emptied out slowly, one person at a time, until the hallways grew quiet and the air took on that after-hours stillness. I didn't need to be there, not really, but I couldn't bring myself to go home yet. I needed time to think, or maybe just to exist in a space where no one expected anything from me. As I was gathering my things, I heard footsteps outside my door. I didn't have to look to know who it was. He paused, then knocked once on the frame before stepping in slightly. I need your input on a project timeline. Won't take long. I nodded, motioned toward the spare chair. He sat. We discussed dates, deliverables, assigned names. Efficient, sharp, to the point. Just like always. But as we reached the last bullet point, he looked at me for a moment too long. Not searching. Just still. I'm aware, he said suddenly, his tone even, that this is complicated. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to. Because I didn't know how to. We don't have to talk about it, he added. But I didn't want to pretend it never happened either. Still, I said nothing. My hands were resting on the keyboard, perfectly still. My screen had gone dim. Then he stood up. Straightened his jacket. Thanks for staying late. He walked out. No lingering glance. No message beneath the words. And yet, it echoed. That night at home, I sat at the edge of the bed with a towel wrapped around my hair, the TV murmuring softly from the living room. My husband was watching a documentary, something about the construction of bridges. I didn't ask questions. I dried my hair in silence and folded my clothes with slow, deliberate movements. As I slid into bed beside him later, he shifted slightly but didn't turn toward me. I looked at the ceiling, counting the slow rhythm of his breaths, wondering what he knew, if anything. Or maybe I was just projecting. That was the part one couldn't decipher anymore, what was real and what was my guilt coloring everything around me. The next day, I found a note in my top drawer at work. A handwritten post-it, and signed. Don't let silence turn into confusion. That was all. My breath caught when I read it. I tucked it into my planner without thinking, closed the drawer, and forced myself to focus. By the time I returned home that evening, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. My husband was already in the kitchen, cooking. A rare sight. The smell of garlic and butter filled the house, and I stood in the doorway watching him slice vegetables with careful precision. He looked up. Felt like cooking tonight. I nodded and stepped in to help. We didn't speak much, but something about the motion, the passing of utensils, the quiet rhythm of chopping, felt familiar. Comfortable, even. That scared me. Because comfort, I realized, could mask so many things: distance, disconnection, even betrayal. As we sat down to eat, he asked how my day was. I said it was fine. I didn't mention the note. I didn't mention staying late. I didn't mention the way silence now felt like a third presence between us, watching everything and saying nothing. Later, as I stood brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection again. There was a tiredness I couldn't hide anymore. Not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from carrying too much and sharing too little. When I climbed into bed, I thought about deleting the note. Tearing it into pieces. Throwing it away. Instead, I folded it smaller and slipped it into the back pocket of my planner. Not as a memory. but as a warning. The day began like all the others, though something about the air felt denser, more difficult to breathe. I moved through the house with quiet efficiency, coffee, shower, hair pulled into a soft twist at the nape of my neck. I chose a navy dress I hadn't worn in a while. Not for any particular reason. It just felt like the only thing in the closet that fit how I felt, contained, but unraveling beneath the surface. My husband sat at the table, reading from his tablet with one hand and stirring a spoon through his cereal with the other. He didn't look up when I walked in. I poured my own coffee, sat down across from him, and stared at the mug. I wasn't sure if I wanted to speak or disappear. He cleared his throat and finally glanced at me. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I kept my eyes on the coffee. "Work's been busy." He nodded, slow and thoughtful, but said nothing else. I finished my drink, stood up, and grabbed my bag. "Have a good day," he said, almost automatically. "You too," I replied, but I didn't look back. At the office, the pace was relentless. Meetings blurred into each other, deadlines hovered like gnats. I moved from one task to the next, answering emails, fielding questions, trying not to think about what was waiting beneath all of it. But by late afternoon, a message popped up on my screen. No name, just 516 tonight. It was all it said. But I knew what it meant. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. By the time the day ended, the building had emptied of most staff. I stayed at my desk longer than necessary, watching the minutes tick by, pretending to work while my fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard. Eventually, I stood, gathered my things, and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove to the address without music, the silence in the car thick with anticipation and doubt. The place wasn't far, just outside the city, near a small lake I remembered passing once or twice. When I arrived, the driveway was quiet. His car already parked. The house stood modest and still, surrounded by trees that rustled faintly in the early evening breeze. I knocked once. The door opened before I could lower my hand. He stepped back to let me in. No words. No expression. Inside, the space was calm. Neutral colors. Clean lines. A fire flickered low in the corner. A bottle of wine sat uncorked on the kitchen counter, 2 glasses beside it. I set my bag down and exhaled slowly, trying to slow the rhythm of my heart. He gestured toward the couch. I sat. The room smelled like cedar and something faintly citrus. The kind of scent that stayed on fabric long after you left. He poured 2 glasses and handed me one. I took it without speaking. Minutes passed. Or maybe seconds. Time felt heavy and elastic, stretched tight between us. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said eventually. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Neither was I." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what that meant. For a while, we just sat. The wine untouched in our hands. The fire casting long shadows across the floor. "I didn't bring you here to make this worse," he said. "I know," I replied. I just wanted a space where things could be quiet for a while. Real. That word lingered. Real. What did that mean now? After a long silence, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the lake shimmered with the last of the light. The trees swayed gently, their silhouettes reflected in the water. The view felt like something from a dream, too still, too perfect. I turned back toward him. We spent the night together. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reckless. It was deliberate and quiet. A decision made without words. One that neither of us stopped nor tried to justify. Later, I lay awake in the dark room, listening to the sound of the wind against the windows. He slept beside me, breathing steady, arm draped across the edge of the bed, not touching. I stared at the ceiling, blank and unmoving, trying to feel something that made sense. But nothing did. There was no triumph. No clarity. Only the weight of what I had done, and what I hadn't been able to stop. In the morning, I rose before him. Dressed in silence. Washed my face in the dim bathroom light. Packed my things and stood for a long time at the doorway, hand on the knob. He stirred as I turned to go, but didn't speak. Just watched. I nodded once, and then stepped outside. The drive home was slow. I took the long route, avoiding the highway. I needed time to figure out what came next. At home, my husband greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked how the offsite had gone. I told him it was fine. Productive. He kissed my temple and returned to his work. I stood in the kitchen alone, watching the kettle boil, steam rising like a ghost between us. Something had shifted. I wasn't sure he sensed it yet. But I knew. And I knew it would only be a matter of time before the silence between us broke wide open. The next morning felt heavier than the ones before. Not for any specific reason, but because everything around me seemed slightly out of place. The hallway light was dimmer, or maybe my eyes were more sensitive. The floor creaked more than usual as I walked toward the kitchen. Or perhaps it always had. My husband was already seated at the table, dressed in his usual neutral tones, coffee in hand, scrolling through something on his phone. I poured my own cup, the sound of liquid hitting porcelain louder than it should have been in the quiet of the room. I didn't speak, and neither did he. The silence between us was starting to feel structured, as if it had rules now. A shape. A weight. He finally looked up and asked if I wanted eggs. I shook my head, thanked him softly. He nodded and returned to his phone. I could feel his gaze brush past me once or twice, but he didn't linger. I wondered, not for the first time, if he knew. If he sensed it. If he had pieced together what I had spent so much energy trying to keep separate. That day at work, I tried to act normal. I buried myself in projects that didn't need to be finished yet, replied to emails with more formality than usual, and avoided anything that might require small talk. When I passed his office, the door was open, but he wasn't at his desk. I kept walking. A few hours later, I saw him in the break room. He was talking to a colleague, laughing quietly, something I hadn't heard from him in weeks. His expression was light, relaxed. It stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not because I wanted something from him, but because I didn't know how to react to his ability to move on so seamlessly, while I carried the noise of it all inside me. We didn't speak that day. Not even a nod. And yet, by the time I got home, I felt more exposed than ever. That evening, my husband surprised me. He had picked up takeout from a place we used to like but hadn't been to in months. He lit a candle at the table, just one, and placed it between the dishes as though we were playing a part we had forgotten. We ate quietly for a while. Then, he looked at me, truly looked, and said, "You've been somewhere else lately." I paused, fork midway between plate and mouth. I didn't answer right away. Then I placed the fork down and met his eyes. "I've been tired," I said. He nodded slowly. Tired. Or distant. There it was. The line between knowing and asking. He hadn't crossed it yet, but he was close. I felt my stomach tighten. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe both." He leaned back in his chair, watching me with that unreadable expression he wore when something mattered. I used to think I understood him better than anyone else. Now I wasn't sure if I understood him at all. After dinner, I offered to clean up. He didn't protest. I stood at the sink, scrubbing plates harder than necessary, hands submerged in hot water, the scent of lemon soap too strong. I needed something physical to hold on to, something routine. Something real. When I came back into the living room, he was gone. I found him in the bedroom, already changed, lying on his side, staring at nothing. I wanted to say something. I didn't. I lay beside him, the space between our bodies vast, even on a queen-sized bed. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep that didn't come. The next day, something shifted. At work, he stopped by my office. Just briefly. Just enough to say there was a change in the upcoming schedule, and we might have to coordinate another off-site. His tone was cool, measured. Professional. No trace of what had happened between us. No flicker of hesitation. When he left, I sat at my desk, hands idle, staring at the empty space where he had stood. Later, in the hallway, I overheard two employees talking about a recent restructuring. Someone mentioned my husband's name, something about a potential transfer, or maybe just a reorganization that would shift teams. My ears rang. I turned the corner before they noticed I was there. That evening, my husband was already home when I arrived. He was making tea, something he rarely did, and the smell of mint filled the kitchen. "There was a message for you," he said as I walked in. I froze. "What kind of message?" He handed me my phone, screen turned off. "Just a reminder from your calendar, I think." I took it from him, careful not to meet his eyes. I checked. It was nothing. An automated alert I had forgotten about. But something in his voice told me it wasn't about the message. It was about the possibility. About the doubt. I thanked him and placed the phone in my bag. He handed me a mug. "You okay?" I nodded. He didn't press further. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at my reflection. My face looked the same. My eyes didn't. There was something sharper around the edges, something quieter. I thought of the lake house. The firelight. The silence. And how, somehow, it had felt both intimate and empty. I had gone there searching for something, to feel seen, to feel understood. But the clarity I thought I'd find had dissolved the moment I walked out the door. Now, the distance between me and my husband felt like a tide that had pulled too far out, leaving behind traces of everything we once were, too scattered to collect, too fragile to step on without breaking. I turned off the light and walked back into the bedroom. He was already asleep. His breathing calm. His back turned to me. I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling again. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had tried to avoid. What was I trying to protect, him or myself? And did it matter anymore? The day began with a strange stillness, the kind that felt intentional, as if the house itself was waiting for something to shift. The light through the kitchen blinds was softer than usual, more hesitant. I stood by the coffee machine, watching the drip and steam, hearing every pop and hiss with sharpened attention. My husband hadn't come down yet, which was unusual. He was always the first to rise, always the first to move. But that morning, he was still upstairs, and I was grateful for the moment alone. When he did come down, he moved quietly, with that same practiced calm that had once brought me comfort and now only reminded me of how little we said to each other. He greeted me with a small nod and a neutral morning, then reached for the cabinet. I responded in kind, and we continued the routine: coffee, toast, silence. The kind of silence that held questions we both refused to ask. Later that morning, at the office, I tried to lose myself in numbers, reports, drafts. I welcomed the banality of the screen, the way spreadsheets gave me something to control. But no matter how many tasks I finished, my mind drifted. He passed my desk once, no eye contact, no hesitation, just a swift motion down the corridor. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen nothing. But I felt it. The invisible thread between us had frayed to something almost imperceptible. And yet, it was still there, just enough to catch on the edge of a thought when I wasn't looking. By lunchtime, I stepped outside for air. Not because I needed it, but because I couldn't sit in that office for another minute without feeling like I was about to break open from the inside. The autumn chill was sharper than expected, and I didn't bring a coat, but I didn't care. I walked slowly around the block, passing cafes full of people who looked like they belonged in their lives. Couples laughing over coffee, professionals talking into their phones, students huddled in corners with laptops and notebooks. They all seemed anchored. I felt unmoored. When I returned to my desk, a message waited for me, not from him, but from the HR department. A scheduling update about upcoming team restructuring. A line caught my eye, your department may undergo leadership reassignments. The language was vague, but my chest tightened anyway. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I had a feeling it would mean something soon. That night, I came home to find my husband already seated at the table, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, and something in his expression had shifted. Not anger. Not even curiosity. Just stillness. Measured, focused stillness. He asked how my day was. I said it was fine. He asked if I'd eaten. I said no. I picked up something earlier, he said, gesturing to a covered plate. It's still warm. I nodded, walked over, and took the plate without speaking. We sat across from each other, eating in near silence. The clinking of cutlery was louder than it should have been. Every sound in that kitchen felt like punctuation in a conversation we weren't having. Then, halfway through his meal, he spoke. I saw your name in an internal report today. I looked up. It was about team rotations, he added. I didn't know your group was being moved. Neither did I. Not officially. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. I guess it's still being finalized, I said quietly. He nodded, looking back at his plate. Probably. We didn't say more. But that short exchange sat between us like a stone in the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. Later, as I stood brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked tired. Not in the way that sleep could fix, but in the way that came from holding too many things beneath the surface. I thought of the lake house again. Of the silence that had stretched between us in that dark room. Of the decision I'd made without fully understanding the cost. Back in bed, my husband was already lying down, reading something on his tablet. I climbed in beside him, careful not to disturb the edge of the mattress. I turned off my lamp. He didn't look over. A few minutes passed, then he asked, "Do you still feel like you're tired, or is it something else now?" I stared at the ceiling. My heart thudded once, then again. I don't know, I said. He nodded. Okay. He didn't push. He never did. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, something changed. When I arrived at the office, I was called into a short meeting with leadership. Nothing formal, nothing alarming, just a heads up about a potential transfer of teams. A restructuring. New reporting lines. I nodded, agreed to be flexible, acted like it was just another corporate shift. But inside, I felt it. Something closing. Or maybe unraveling. When I stepped out of the meeting, I saw him down the hallway. He looked at me, just briefly. A flicker of recognition. A pause. And then he turned and walked away. Back at my desk, I sat for a long time without opening my laptop. At home that night, my husband was waiting. "I need to ask you something," he said as I placed my bag on the chair. I looked at him. "Do you want to be here?" The question was simple. Direct. But not accusing. Not angry. Just still. I stood there, frozen. He repeated it, softer this time. "Do you want to be here? With me?" I opened my mouth. Closed it again. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know what I want anymore." He nodded once. Then turned away. And I knew then. The silence between us was no longer a space for secrets. It was a decision waiting to be made. The morning after felt like the last page of a book I wasn't ready to finish. The air in the bedroom was colder than usual, or maybe it was just the absence of words. My husband had already left the room when I opened my eyes. His side of the bed was still slightly warm, but the space between us had never felt wider. Downstairs, I found him standing by the window, coffee in hand, dressed for work. He didn't turn when I entered. He just said, "There's extra in the pot," and continued staring out at the yard. I poured a cup in silence and sat at the table, the ceramic warm between my palms. For several minutes, neither of us moved. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say something meaningful. But I didn't know what was left to say that wouldn't sound like a defense or an excuse. So I just watched the steam rise from the cup until it disappeared. When he finally turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. "I'm working late," he said. "There's soup in the fridge if you want it." I nodded. He left without another word. That day at the office, everything looked the same but felt different. People moved through their routines, unaware of how close I was to slipping out of my own. I checked my inbox, responded to a few requests, avoided unnecessary conversations. I felt like a shadow of myself, present but not truly there. Near midday, I was called into another meeting. It was short but definitive. My team was being reassigned. Effective immediately, I would be reporting to a new department under a different chain of leadership. I listened with practiced professionalism, nodding in all the right places, asking no questions. But the truth settled hard in my chest: I wouldn't be seeing him anymore. There would be no more shared projects. No more silent glances. No more anything. When I left the meeting room, I walked down the hallway slower than usual. I passed his office, glanced inside. It was empty. I stood there for a moment, pretending to review something on my phone, hoping he might return. He didn't. Eventually, I turned and walked away. By the time I reached my desk, I felt a strange calm. Not peace, but surrender. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when everything is still broken but no longer shaking. That evening, I returned home to an empty house. My husband had said he'd be late, but there was something final about the way the silence greeted me. I reheated the soup. Ate alone. Washed the dishes. The movements felt mechanical. Later, I sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on. The television was off, the house dim except for the soft light from the lamp beside me. I stared at the wall across the room, not seeing it. Eventually, I went upstairs. I stood in our bedroom, looking at the bed, the closet, the photos on the dresser. There was one of us from years ago, on vacation, smiling in a way we hadn't in a long time. I picked it up, studied the edges, then set it back down. I packed a small bag. Not everything. Just what I needed for a few nights. I wasn't leaving for good. At least, that's what I told myself. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Short. Honest. I need a few days. Please don't take this as an ending. I just need space to think. Then I walked out the door. I didn't have a plan. I drove aimlessly at first, then checked into a modest hotel on the edge of the city. I didn't want comfort. I wanted distance. The room was plain, beige walls, stiff sheets, the faint hum of traffic through the window. It was perfect in its nothingness. I sat on the bed, stared at the floor, and let the weight of everything settle. What had started as a search for something, attention, connection, maybe even escape, had led me here. To a room not my own, in a city that didn't care who I was, with no one waiting for me on the other side of the door. I reached into my bag and pulled out my planner. The small folded note he had written weeks ago was still tucked inside. Don't let silence turn into confusion. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it again and placed it back. The next morning, I called my husband. He didn't answer. I didn't leave a voicemail. Instead, I opened the curtains, let the morning light in, and sat by the window. The world outside moved on, the cars passed, people walked, a child shouted something I couldn't hear. Life didn't pause for mistakes. It didn't wait for clarity. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I'd go back, or if he would ask me to. I didn't know if we could rebuild something that had been quietly eroding for years. But for the first time in months, I wasn't pretending. I was still. And that, I thought, was something.